today is slightly different, actually, to previous Robert Oakeshott lectures, but unsurprisingly, because it is our 40th year. So, first of all, there's going to be a short tribute to our founder, Robert Oakeshott, delivered by David Erdl and Isabel Oakeshott, Robert's niece. And this will be immediately followed by the lecture, delivered by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, after which there'll be a chance for you to ask questions of Mariana, so get your thinking caps on whilst you're listening to her. Before that, I think most of you know that the EOA membership includes professional advisors who we're very fortunate to have in the network, who are all role models and champions of better business. And today's lecture, I'm really delighted, is supported by one of those organisations. So before we move on, I want to invite Robert Postlethwaite, the founder of specialist employee-owned lawyers and employee-owned business, Postlethwaites, just to say a few words.
Okay, thank you, Deb, and thank you for listening. Good morning. So I'm really excited that Postlethwaite is sponsoring this year's Robert Oakeshott lecture from Mariana. Perhaps the best way for me to explain why we're so enthusiastic, is to tell you, as briefly as a lawyer can possibly manage, what we do. So our practice is founded in the belief that capitalism needs a reboot, identifying employee ownership as one prominent and significant feature of that. Now, there's clearly a bigger picture in play here, as we grapple not just with who really creates our wealth and how it is shared, but also with sustainability, decarbonisation, and moving to a circular economy. Well, one legal practice can't single-handedly fix everything, but we can do our bit. Companies come to us when they want to change how they're owned, moving from founder ownership to majority employee ownership, or at an earlier stage in their life, if they want to begin to share ownership with their employees right from the off. We listen to what they want to do, and so long as it's not impossible, which happens only rarely, we tell them how they can do it, and then we take it from there. In discussion with a friend recently about what we do, they said, with cautious enthusiasm, so it's really about redistributing wealth? I would put it a little differently. Perhaps a fuller way to describe employee ownership is that it's about fostering growth in a way which enables those whose efforts have created that growth, in a large part the business's employees, to reap the benefits long term, involving work with a positive purpose and a route to fulfillment. Mariana's work, and I'm quoting from her website, focuses on growth which is innovation-led, inclusive and sustainable. And she's written penetratingly about who really creates wealth. I see a beautiful fit between these themes and employee ownership. Inclusivity, giving proper recognition to employees' contribution to wealth creation, is at the core, and I think links umbilically to innovation. Sustainability is realistically perhaps a little bit more of a work in progress. I'm going to give you an example of a company we recently worked with. The chairman, this is a company that's now converted to employee ownership. The chairman has his own private plane and racing car. So you can imagine the carbon that he produces regularly on a daily basis. However, he does drive a Tesla for getting to and from the office. So that's his kind of carbon offsetting program. So that's probably a work in progress. However, we can contrast that with the co-founder, or possibly co-founders, I'm not quite sure yet, this is another conversation I need to have, of a company that very recently converted to becoming employee-owned. And at least one of those founders, they've now swapped their Lotus for a Toyota Prius and plan to use more of their time as climate change activists now that they're no longer involved in the ownership of the company. Well, it's easy enough to have opinions on what's wrong and to say we need to move towards a fairer and more inclusive capitalism. But it's far harder to flesh out what change is actually needed and why, and then put forward well-worked ideas on how to go about it. That's why we need thinkers like Mariana, and I'm so much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Following Robert Oakeshott's death in 2011, the EOA has been hosting this important lecture in his memory ever since. And I think in our 40th year, it's ever more important. Robert's just touched on some of the reasons why. Because in 2019, there's a desperate and urgent need to find new ways to deliver sustainable, responsible, and inclusive business that can deliver more benefits to society. And as wealth inequality continues to grow, employees and others are challenging the unfairness and short-termism found in shareholder-driven economies. And as our political structures struggle to keep pace with the changing needs of society, citizens are demanding a greater say and more devolved decision-making. And finally, as our environment creaks in the weight of overuse, entrepreneurs and business leaders are exploring new ways to deliver a more regenerative, circular economy, including consideration of the important role of cities and regions. Since its formation in 1979, the EOA has been a champion of what we now refer to as better business. And whilst this ambition has been expressed in different ways over those 40 years by the different custodians who've led the EOA, the same meaning has sustained. Better business results from employees having both a stake and a say in the business in which they work, supported by a transparent and engaging culture that provides the employee voice and influence, which together deliver economic, social and well-being benefits to the individual, to the business, to the regions in which those businesses exist, and ultimately to the national economy. So for all of those reasons, I'm absolutely delighted that our guests today provide us with a chance to both reflect on Robert's ambition for better business and to encourage us to look forward and reconsider how we can deliver a more sustainable capitalism. So firstly, I'm going to welcome two people who knew Robert very well. David Erdl is an honorary research fellow at the School of Management at the University of St Andrews. He's got an MA in Chinese from Oxford, an MBA from Harvard, and a PhD in the psychology of sharing and evolutionary approach from St Andrews. He's worked in the area of economic democracy for decades, leading and helping all employee buyouts of several companies. He's also the author of one of the standout books on the topic, Beyond the Corporation, and has been a long-standing supporter of the EOA. Some of you will also know that David led his own family business, Tullis Russell, into employee ownership, so he really has got the T-shirt. But first, before David joins us on stage, I'd like to welcome Isabel Oakeshott, Robert's niece, who will say a few words on behalf of Robert's family.
Good morning, and thank you very much to the organisers for squeezing me in at the last minute. I know there are a lot of speakers today, so don't worry, I'm going to be super speedy. I'm Robert's niece. My dad, Evelyn, was Robert's twin. And some of you here today will know that my dad sadly died last October. This was an event that he was always very, very proud to be associated with, and I'm sure that he's going to be looking down on us today. I used to visit Robert quite regularly in his messy but bright and cheerful flat in North London, and he would always want to talk about politics. And I've been trying to imagine what he would make of our current political mess. And I'm really sorry that he's not around to have that debate with me, because I suspect that he would profoundly disagree with my position as a Brexiteer. And I know that we'd have had a lot of fun knocking our opinions back and forth. And, you know, Robert's style was often to do more listening than talking. And he would usually trot out some of his favourite stock phrases like, I suspect that's more true than untrue, or so-and-so is more good than bad. What I think we would agree on is the exasperating extent to which the political turmoil over Brexit is sapping all the time and energy of the government to pursue things that really matter to people in their daily lives. I think he'd be cheered up by a few things that this government has managed to do when it's not tearing itself and each other apart. For example, the presumption of consent in organ donation was something he fought really hard for, and that comes into law next year. And I think he'd be delighted by that. And I think he would also be quite interested in the work of our prisons minister, Rory Stewart, because prisons reform was something that he was very interested in. And Rory has taken a very principled stance in his position and, for example, has vowed to resign if violence in prison isn't improved by this autumn. I don't know whether he knows something that we don't about how those statistics are going to look. But I do think, those achievements aside, Robert would be frustrated by how little attention employee ownership is getting. And this organisation is doing wonderful things to make sure it does get the hearing amidst all the noise that we have about everything else at the moment. Employee-owned businesses achieve higher productivity and greater levels of innovation, and they're more resilient to economic turbulence. Really importantly, they also have more engaged and fulfilled and less stressed workforces. Now more than ever, in these incredibly challenging and unstable political and economic times, employee ownership feels really relevant. So when our politicians have finally returned to their senses, and it may be quite some wait, I think there's a huge opportunity here for all of us who believe in the employee ownership business model to present it as part of the process of reshaping our economy for post-Brexit Britain, if we ever get there. Let's seize that opportunity. Thank you.
It's a great privilege to be given a few minutes to speak about Robert, who was an inspiration and a very good friend. The anonymous obituarist in The Guardian got it right, I think, in summarizing one view of Robert, anyway, as he was the most convivial and the worst dressed person of his generation, and spoke of his intoxicating and often intoxicated discourse. Robert was absolutely inspiring in that way. Deb set me a bit of a challenge, which was to try to say something about what motivated Robert. Why was Robert like that? And I think there are patterns that you can see quite early on in his history. I think I've got an early-ish. No, what is this? The right arrow. Oh, there we go. Right. Different stages in Robert's life. I think the first thing about Robert, which marked him for life, was he was born into the elite. His father had a spell as Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University before settling back into just rector of Lincoln College. And he himself went to one of the schools that are laughingly called the great public schools, and then went on to Balliol. So it wouldn't have been surprising with that background to see him round a cabinet table in government or at the top of a law firm or an academic institution. But Robert was anything but conventional right from the beginning. And I think that one of the springs of that was a deep fellow feeling for anybody who is oppressed, and a delight, an absolute delight, an infectious delight when anybody who was oppressed stood up against it. So in 1956, when the Hungarians started their uprising against the dictatorial communist government, Robert was absolutely galvanized by that, not just to think in support, like as most of the students did, but to do something. So he collected together, he organized the students to collect together a whole lot of practical aid, and then drove down with friends to deliver it in person. Unfortunately, the Russians invaded just as they crossed the border, more or less, and so they had to skedaddle back out again fairly quickly. But it was recognized 50 years later when he was made a hero of the Hungarian Revolution. When he left university, he joined the Financial Times eventually, did some journalist training up north, and then for the Financial Times as a foreign correspondent. And he really was an internationalist in every way. He ended up as the Paris correspondent, but then he gave up that position in order to go to Africa and undermine the British Empire. However, the Financial Times did mark him because when he was writing, he used to do a lot of case studies. And when he was writing them, he used to, every fact had to be checked and rechecked. And frankly, it became a bit of a pain for the people at the other end. In Africa, firstly, he joined Kenneth Kaunda as an advisor to help in the transition of Zambia to independence. Now, Zambia has got tremendous mineral resources, and they were paying a lot of money to the colonial mining company that was involved, which then put in a request for compensation for giving back the mineral rights to the people who obviously should have had them from the beginning. Robert wrote and researched a paper for Kenneth Kaunda, which led to him saying no, I'm not paying any compensation. There is no justification for compensation. And instead, as a gesture of goodwill, he paid 4% of the sum which had originally been asked for. So that was Robert at work again, against the oppression of a poor system. He then got interested in cooperatives through Patrick van Rensburg, who was running cooperative schools in Botswana. And Robert moved down to Botswana and helped in building a new cooperative school, which combined education and labor. They built the school as they studied there. The interesting cooperatives led on to the discovery of Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain. And Robert was the first person to write in English about these cooperatives, which are now iconic throughout the world, at least the world of cooperatives. I think then comes the unlikeliest stage in Robert's life, when he became a construction worker, probably inspired by the schools. He went to Sunderland and founded a cooperative, a workers' cooperative in the building industry. Now, Robert, as you may probably realize, even just by looking at him, was the most unlikely construction worker in the world. And the cooperative didn't last that long. But he had a lawyer, a young lawyer in a city firm. You know, his connections, he sustained his connections all his life, and he used to use them. And he got the legal work in setting up the cooperative designed by a city firm, and it was given as a task to a new young lawyer to do pro bono. The lawyer was Bob Ayling, who then became eventually chief executive of British Airways. Bob explained to Robert that there should be a memo setting out the purpose and the articles setting out the rules of the company. So he said Robert went away and came back the next morning having written the Communist Manifesto. Now, one of the carpenters in the workers' cooperative, they were all given a copy of this, and he took it home and didn't read it, but his wife read it. His wife was Margaret Elliott, who was then inspired many years later to start a wonderful home care cooperative in Sunderland, and then to start a kind of ginger group that helps others start them all around the area. Robert at that point was pulling together friends, essentially, for random meetings of something he called Job Ownership Limited. It really was quite random, and it was just his friends and family members. The meetings would take place when he would phone up and he would say, let's have a meeting next week, sort of thing. And in later years, there was always a lot of red wine at these board meetings. Later, the wine came from a Bulgarian entrepreneur who, in my view, had only questionable employee ownership credentials. I never really believed him. But on the other hand, the wine was very good. And through JOL and through using all his contacts, Robert had a real influence in developing legislation for employee ownership. Joe Grimmond, the original chairman of Job Ownership Limited, was involved through the Lib Lab Pact of the late 70s in the first really good employee share ownership scheme. And in the early 90s, when Ken Clarke was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, magically, draft legislation for an employee ownership trust, tax benefited, appeared on his desk as it was coming up towards the budget. It was incorporated in the budget and became law. The reason why it magically appeared was because his assistant, one of his assistants, was an old friend of Robert's. So by magic, it happened. The drafting, I think, was probably done by Graham Nuttall, whose name was later put in lights in the Nuttall report. When Robert retired from his work through Job Ownership Limited, it looked for a while as if it was going to fold, but eventually we found Patrick Burns, who started the process of transforming it into a membership organization, which it is just now, growing so successfully. We must mention Robert's books. He wrote in the 1970s one which is famous all over the world in the cooperative world, The Case for Workers' Co-ops, on everybody's shelves wherever you go, and one which should be called Jobs and Fairness, which also, it has a chapter on David Ellerman's thought, which for me is the best mind working on employee ownership at the moment. I thought I'd tell one personal experience of Robert to give some sense of the impact that he had. I met him in the early 80s, and I was impressed, mesmerized really, by his authoritative discussion, his knowledge on employee ownership. So I invited him to speak to the board of Tallis Russell. Now, Tallis Russell was in Scotland, and a lot of the directors had worked their way up from the floor, several of the directors, from the shop floor. They were a pretty tough lot, and very Scottish. And for me, there was a lot hanging on this meeting, because I hadn't won the argument about the future ownership of the company at all. I didn't have any standing in the board. I wasn't yet. I did have a genetic advantage in that I was the chairman's nephew, but I hadn't really established anything there. I assumed that Robert would dress appropriately to meet the directors of a not insignificant company. He turned up in an old jacket. His tie carried the marks, the history of a few meals. He took off his jacket for the meeting, and he had underneath a pink sweater, which he was wearing back to front. And The reason why he was wearing it back to front was because he'd gone through the elbows. And so the holes appeared on the front of the elbows. And his flies were gaping open. He said that the zip had broken that morning, and he'd only had time to go out and buy a nappy pin. Now, if you remember with terry toweling nappies, there used to be these huge pins, but they did require a technique. If you were going to close something with them, you had to overlap the material and put it through both levels a couple of times. He hadn't done that. He'd put it through once on this side, once on the other side. And this was a pin which was marketed for a girl baby. So the sliding head that fixed it closed was bright pink. It was really a shock, frankly. And you can imagine the director's reaction. And being in Scotland with those people, it actually got worse when he started to speak, because his voice always carried the trace of his roots. And he was far too poncy and posh, frankly, or he sounded far too poncy and posh for Fife. But on the other hand, at the end of an hour, there was a serious discussion going on, inspired by Robert's magic. And I saw that happen again and again, actually, working with him in Slovenia later on, helping 12 companies who'd been privatized into majority employee ownership. Again and again, you would sit down for dinner, and the next day, you would discover that you were Robert's friend for life. You had a hangover at the same time. If you had anything to do with employee ownership, he would invite you to come to Merton in midwinter and join in the Job Ownership Limited conferences, which are now, they now have hundreds of people coming to the conferences, the employee ownership conferences. But there, we were lucky if we got a few tens of people. Nonetheless, it was a short, cram time. Everybody who came spoke. A lot of them couldn't speak very good English. And you got, 5 or 10 minutes, something like that, to speak. The chair was ruthless in terms of timekeeping. It was James Cornford, an old friend of his, who was very good-natured, but absolutely ruthless that nobody could speak more than the allotted time. Robert was very, very busy at those conferences. And he did attract a range of quite distinguished people to come and join in. Once I was standing speaking to Jeff Gates, he had been the counsel to the Senate Finance Committee in America at the time of the passing of the first employee ownership legislation. And we were chatting, and Robert appeared, and Jeff put on a sort of loud, hail fellow, well met voice, and said, "Hi, Robert," and Robert came over to say hello. And as Robert approached, he said, in the same loud voice, he said, "Bit gamey today, aren't we, Robert?" But that actually was unusual. It was normally just an appearance thing rather than a cleanliness thing. James Cornford reckoned that Robert did that as a test, that if you cared about how he appeared, then you weren't worth spending a great deal of time on. When he was delighted, and he often was delighted, particularly when with news of a new company becoming employee-owned or whatever, then he would chuckle. And I think today he would definitely be chuckling. At the growth of employee ownership, the transformation of Job Ownership Limited into the Employee Ownership Association, and above all, at the quality of today's speaker, whose empirical work, shifting the focus of economics away from the damaging neoliberal financial paradigm, is unparalleled in my view. So, I think that as well as this fellow feeling, it does seem to me that the bottom was this tremendous fellow feeling for people who are oppressed. But there was also an absolute commitment to fairness and this wonderful, decisive, active approach, that you don't just think, you go and do. So it's a great privilege to have remembered Robert for you a wee bit. Cheers.
Thank you, David. So that was the magic of Robert. One thing I've probably taken from there is I need to drink more red wine. Maybe that's the success factor. So it's now my really huge pleasure to introduce Professor Mariana Mazzucato. But before I ask her to join me on stage, let me just set the scene of her impressive achievements, and I will need to refer to my notes for this. Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, Mariana is an award-winning, best-selling author of many books on progressive economics. She is winner of the 2014 New Statesman Sperry Prize in Political Economy, the 2015 Hans Matthäus Prize, and the 2018 Leon Teef Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. She was named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic and is on the Bloomberg 50 list of ones to watch for 2019. Her new book, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, looks at the need to reward value creation over value extraction and was shortlisted for the 2018 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year prize. And whilst all of that must leave you and I catching your breath, she also advises policymakers around the world on innovation-led inclusive growth and is currently a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisors, the UN's Committee for Development Policy, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Citra's Advisory Panel in Finland, and Norway's Research Council. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you so much, and I must say I'm so happy, David, that you went through Robert's history, because I think it's a real honor for me to be able to speak in that tradition of really thinking through the connections between how you distribute wealth and how you create it. It's simply not true that it's created in one place and then redistributed in another. How we redistribute, how we own, but especially how we come to the table to discuss what it is we want to create, so that, for example, trade unions don't have to just worry about it at the end through things like the just transition, making sure that the transition, say, to a greener economy doesn't displace too many workers. The workers should be at the table in the first place, even thinking about, alongside other stakeholders in the private sector and the public sector, of what a green transition might look like. And I think those kinds of, this is a clicker, yeah? Those kinds of issues and debates are the debates of the future if we actually want to redirect growth. There's too much obsession, of course, on the rate of growth. Talking about the direction of growth requires thinking about value creation in a much more healthy, debatable, contested way. And this whole, oops, forgot my first slide. This whole issue of purpose and how we actually bring purpose back into different types of businesses. I was giving a talk this morning for the Wired, some sort of Wired anniversary. I didn't realize that I was like the only speaker. I showed up for this breakfast meeting and they had 500 people there and said, go on stage. I was like, what? Where's my croissant? Anyway, half of the people there for no breakfast. So I'm hoping there's something out there, given the sponsoring of the event. And so there's all these B Corps. How do we make this an intelligent debate that is also a thorn in the side of the current system, as opposed to just one that everyone feels so comfortable with? So I guess that's what I want to do. I want to be a thorn in the side a bit here on this topic. And I should say that the reason I actually wrote the book that I did, that's outside hopefully somewhere, The Value of Everything, which I'm going to talk about somewhat, but I'll be talking about broader issues, is how narrow this topic of wealth creation is, even in the Labor Party, right? Labor Party, laboring, lots of people work. You'd think that the term wealth creation would actually be a really interesting, broad, dynamic term. And when they lost when the Labour Party lost the 2015 election, I was astounded by the articles the next day of why they thought they lost. There was this idea that we lost because we didn't embrace the wealth creators. I was like, what? That word for them at the moment of writing these articles was we didn't embrace business. And of course business creates wealth. And of course we have to structure businesses so they create wealth. But the fact that the Labour Party itself was using it in such a narrow way I found astounding. And in fact, this goes back to Ed Miliband's attempt to bring that debate, regardless of what one thinks, if one is Labour Party or not, it doesn't matter, these debates come up. When Ed Miliband brought up this issue that we needed a more productive form of capitalism, a less predatory one, it was very interesting that, again, he was told, hush, hush, that's a bit too tense. That's going to be too much of a thorn in the side. Let's make this more, a more diluted topic. And in fact, that whole interesting topic that could have brought us back, actually, to the core of economic theory, what kind of capitalism do we want? How can we make sure that the value that's being created by different businesses and different actors are replowed back into the economy as opposed to siphoned out, was a really interesting debate to be had for both parties, and it was kind of just siphoned off. But it was interesting that both someone like Ed Miliband, who's of course center-left, and then Larry Fink, running one of the richest companies in the world, and all sorts of other people have been actually asking that the debate out there be again about purpose. This was the famous letter that Larry, CEO of BlackRock, wrote to 500 CEOs saying, we've lost our way. We need to rediscover purpose. There's too much money just being siphoned out. There's too much short-termism, too much speculation, and there was this call for action. Which has been repeated recently by people like Paul Polman, the head of Unilever, who's about to step down. And so what I want to do is basically, first of all, just pause here and say, this is extremely important. But in order for it to really do what it needs to do, which is to reform, reorient, transform, kind of, in some ways, revolutionize the current state of capitalism, which is very problematic, we need to, first of all, just realize how problematic it is, and I'm going to depress you a bit with some sort of current state of affairs, but also then go back to the pillars of, well, what is value? Why have we sort of gotten into this system where it's just so easy to call oneself a value creator without kind of an objective eye of all the different actors, the collective group of different types of actors in the public sector, in the private sector, in different types of third sector organizations, which, by the way, are increasingly important in areas like new thinking around health and energy, trade unions, which got us things like weekends and 8-hour workdays in the past. My God, how important was that in terms of a social innovation? Just really rethinking how all these different actors, if structured in particular ways, if also interacting in interesting, dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic ways, can get us a much more interesting system to achieve that kind of innovation-led, sustainable, inclusive growth. So first, let me just depress you a bit, so then you have something to get picked up for. But you all look already a bit depressed, so come on, start smiling. I should make you get up and do jumping jacks. I should be depressed. I already gave a talk this morning, which I didn't realize was going to be a talk. So we've got 4 problems. We've got many more than 4, but I'm just going to kind of signal 4. First, we have a serious problem in the financial sector. And by that, I mean the broad-based financial sector, including all the shadow banking system and financial intermediation as a whole. And this graph here is from the Bank of England. Andy Haldane, who I always say is the sexiest banker around, and not necessarily for his looks, but what he says, he's very interesting. I've been surprised he hasn't been kicked out yet. He's the chief economist of the Bank of England. He's often showing these kind of figures and saying, we got a problem. What's the problem? Finance is financing finance. Right? They're supposed to be financing kind of the real stuff in the economy to grease the wheels of commerce. But when you have finance financing fire, and by that you're supposed to be worried about flames, but literally finance, insurance, and real estate, as opposed to the real stuff, you get this kind of graph where the growth of financial intermediation in terms of a percentage of gross value added has completely outpaced the growth of everything else. And that, however, sometimes leads to the wrong analysis, which is, then we need industrial policy to reorient the economy away from this big bad stuff, the hedge funds, the derivatives, the credit default swaps, towards industry. And the problem there is we got an industry problem. And here I'm talking about big sort of global trends. The industry problem is industry itself has become financialized. And so this is just one of the thermometer temperature takers here in terms of the data that's up here. But the amount of money being made that's not reinvested back into the system is escalating at record rates. So both in terms of hoarding, we have record rates in both Europe and the US. In both cases, it's 2 trillion euros worth in Europe. In the US, it's over $2 trillion. But especially this issue of financialization in terms of profits being used mainly for dividend payouts and share buybacks. The combination of those two, in some cases, being over 100% of net income. In other words, dipping into capital reserves to distribute the wealth, if you want, back to the shareholders is a problem. And by the way, I think this is the problem. It's not the robots. Everyone's saying robots are going to take our jobs. Robots aren't taking our jobs. The lack of reinvestment takes jobs away because skills themselves, skills of workers, are an outcome, not just of government training programs, but they have been historically an outcome also of what happens inside companies if people working in those companies are invested in. And in fact, if you read David Ricardo and this book on value, I kind of go back 400 years of economic history, and David Ricardo was writing in the 1800s, he already talked about the robots problem. This is nothing new. He had a chapter in Principles of Political Economy, chapter 31. Don't ask me why I remember these. I literally don't remember what I did yesterday, but I remember this. Chapter 31, called On Machinery. He was basically saying all this technological change that he was witnessing, was happening back then with the Industrial Revolution, all this mechanization is taking people's jobs and it's reducing wages and in some cases also really having problematic effects on working conditions. What you then had, though, for 200 years after that, basically up until the 1980s, is it didn't matter. It's true. Mechanization has more or less been labor displacing, but the profits being made in this part of the economy with machine A were plowed back into another part where new forms of jobs and skills were needed, and so overall, you didn't have sort of mass unemployment. And you also, of course, had, again, trade unions and different types of organizations fighting for the conditions, et cetera, but as long as profits were being vested. And it's only really once we come to the 1980s with this obsession about maximizing shareholder value as opposed to stakeholder value, which is everything this conference and event seems to me about in your organization. Stakeholder value, both in terms of ownership, but not only in terms of investment, in terms of how we're thinking about that investment, how we're thinking about the wealth creation, both within a company and what it's doing in the economy. When that kind of slips to the side and we become obsessed with maximizing shareholder value, you get this stuff. And you also get, on aggregate, and this is really actually a global trend, fall in business investment. I see this in the innovation world, and the UK, by the way, is a real kind of, symbol of this. Falling business spending on R&D, especially in the really high-risk stuff. And we could maybe talk about this a bit if people are interested in terms of what's happening now with open innovation and open science. But also, the UK's growth, and this is just a fact, it's not really up for debate, is mainly consumption-led. So GDP can be distributed in the different types of demand, so consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This country continues to grow mainly through consumption-led growth that's funded through private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at record levels. And guess what? That's what caused the financial crisis. Kind of obsessed about public debt, private debt, which is how the economy is growing, is a huge problem. But anyway, this whole issue of, well, how do we then transform that? How do we move from a consumption-led to an investment-led growth? Who is, investing for what? Is this just about infrastructure, or is it about actually solving interesting societal challenges along the way? Is something I'll come to towards the end of the talk. But this is the second problem. The third is the state itself. Let me see if these came up. No, you can't see anything. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. The state's problem is it's kind of just lost its way, right? Going to the moon and back again required a mission. It required actually thinking about market making, market shaping with different types of actors. Again, I'll come to that later because this concept of missions is really interesting today, where we're setting ourselves out with these really bold and inspirational sustainable development goals. But just in general, the state has performed in most interesting ways in terms of its organizations. It's not the state, Big Brother, but the decentralized network of different types of public organizations, which would include, say, the BBC in this country, when it's not just fixing things as things screw up along the way, but actually being quite ambitious about changing the landscape, also creating new opportunities to crowd in, for example, business activity, but not just waiting for something to go wrong. So it's quite interesting how the economics framework of thinking of how of what the state's role is very much wed to this idea that you're just fixing market failures. You can make it more interesting and talk about system failures. But my previous book, The Entrepreneurial State, basically showed that we would have never had Silicon Valley had the state simply done that. You know, everything in your iPhones or whatever smartphone you have. By the way, Huawei, if you have a Huawei phone, is a cooperative. I always tell them, remind people that you're kind of like John Lewis. I might be more friendly to you, but no. Anyway. We should talk about that, actually, what's happening today with co-ops in China. It's very interesting and not very well known. Anyway, this idea that they're just, fixing market failures wouldn't have helped us understand all the investments that led to some really radical technologies like the internet, GPS, Siri, touchscreen display, which are all publicly financed, but also more recently in the green revolution that is happening actually across the world. There is, for example, a large role for public banks, mainly the Chinese one, the Brazilian one, up until recently the German one and the EIB, which actually have been investing in really high-risk things, which later the private financial sector enters. That's not fixing failures, that's actually willingness to take risks, to delve into this uncertain world of technological and market co-creation. But that's really hard to do, right? It's hard to do. So simply thinking that you're there to fix things and then doesn't ask the right questions of how to actually structure state institutions in the right way so they can be bold. And then one of the biggest problems, because this is, if can't sort this out, everything else almost doesn't matter. We just have, a huge, if you want, planetary issue right now with climate change, and there's simply not enough being spent, not just in the renewable energy area, but literally just transforming manufacturing in terms of lowering its carbon footprint. And, if we don't solve this, again, we're not going to have a planet to live on. And the recent IPCC report about we've got 12 years left should be a massive wake-up call. So what I tried to do in the book is both to do the wake-up call, but also say we need to go back to the foundations, because so many of the problems that I see, even in my limited world of innovation and tech, et cetera, is that there's so many stories about where wealth comes from that then actually become the underpinning of some of the most regressive, for example, taxation policies that people like Piketty have outlined that have come about since the 1970s, which he thinks are really important in terms of causing a redistribution problem. But if you look at how those policies came about, there were stories being told about how to create a more knowledge-intensive economy, how to reward value creation activity. And I'll just give you an example. One of the most problematic policies that I've seen come about in this country is the patent box, which basically reduces taxes on profits earned by patents, a patent and technology. Patents are already monopolies for 20 years. You get monopoly profits for 20 years. So we've already solved the profits problem with the patent. It makes no sense for the policymaker to reduce the taxation on those kinds of profits. There's all sorts of other things you can do to incentivize that, but all that does is increase profits. It doesn't increase the reinvestment of those profits. And as I mentioned before, we actually have no profits problem. Profits are at record levels, the profit labor share is. But if you look at how that happened, because it's not just a dumb policy, it happened through a whole story that was told to by government, by one particular pharmaceutical company, which I should just name, but I'll stop now because I've been told afterwards that, I might get kidnapped along the way home if you saw The Constant Gardener. And I think that's what's really important. It's not just about high-level aggregate kind of economic thinking. It's can we better understand why it's so easy to con, whether it's a policymaker or someone else, through stories about value creation just to get sort of benefit to one's own organization. And Plato was not stupid when he said storytellers rule the world. So in some ways, the point of this book was really to go back to the stories that are being told about value in order to actually get more intelligent discussions and make the concept of value creation and wealth creation much more contested, less just about, oh, let me call myself a wealth creator. And so this whole notion of who makes, who takes, which kind of, if you look at the history of economic thought, is a recurring issue. And I usually put up the slide, which is unfortunately the only one I took out. I have too many slides, by Big Bill Haywood. He was the first industrial trade unionist. He said, those who kind of mine the gold have hardly any share of the gold that actually comes out. And he has this wonderful quote like, they don't mill the gold, they don't mine the gold, they don't, but they own it all. What happened there? So he's basically saying the takers are ruling the economy, the makers are getting a bad deal. But that can become quickly a very static and kind of boring discussion, especially if we put the word who there. Who makes, who takes? It sounds very accusatory, like that first slide I had, which, the hedge funds, the derivatives, bad, industry, good. The real question is, how do we change how we think about making and actually reward the making and have a much more broader understanding of that collective effort that goes into that and reward it so actually we plow more money back into the economy, but especially have an idea of how. How do we actually get interesting conversations of what value to create, not just how. And what's interesting is just that this kind of self-proclamation, I'm a value creator, even after the financial crisis where we know that there was a huge, if you want, problem within the investment banking community. It was incredible how Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and this was not an after-dinner joke or anything, he literally just with a straight face said Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. So the degree to which we actually even measure, how we measure productivity, actually allows an actor in the financial community simply because they are earning a lot. And if price becomes the indicator of value, which it kind of is, and I'll mention this later when we look at GDP, to make that proclamation, it's much harder, say, for a school teacher to say that, because we literally don't even in GDP include the value that's created, for example, with public education. We only include the salaries. We only include the costs. So what we are valuing, but literally in terms of the inputs and the outputs, how that actually also constrains the system in terms of what philosophers call performativity, how we actually measure the performance of an area, let's just call it the economy, then affects how we think about that economy, how we act, and that feeds back into how we theorize about it. It really can become sort of a vicious loop. But what's striking is literally the level of confidence that some people have, calling themselves productive and value creators. And again, when's the last time you heard civil servants saying, we create wealth, or a school teacher saying, I'm so productive? And so really kind of rethinking that. And what's interesting is that that debate about who creates or where does value actually come from, it really is kind of the tense way that economists used to speak. And it often, coincided with what was actually happening in the economy. So the mercantilists writing back in the 1600s, when you had the 1651 Navigation Acts, it's not surprising they actually thought it was trade, it was exchange. So you had to actually get the right free trade agreements or terms of trade. This is kind of the Trump talk, right? It's he puts all the blame on the trade agreements as opposed to really rethinking also the governance structure of the companies inside the US. So that was interesting, just how they understood trade itself and how trade occurs as the source of value. The physiocrats put it at their understanding of value in terms of farm labor. They actually had what I call the first Excel sheet ever. This is the Tableau économique of Quenet, where he divided the economy into the productive class, again, 1700s agricultural community here, productive class who were basically the farmers making the agricultural goods, the proprietors who were basically just kind of selling it, so basically the mercantilist class, and then the sterile class, the landlords. He called them the sterile class because literally he thought that if too much money was being siphoned out by the landlords and by the kings and the queens and not being replowed back into the system would become sterile. It literally wouldn't reproduce. And so how the wealth that's created is distributed then affects how much you can actually create. And this was central to their theory. They very much focused on that reproductive capacity of the economy and used words like sterility to describe it. And the classical economists were quite interesting because, again, they were writing in the 1800s, exactly when I mentioned David Ricardo was writing, so during the Industrial Revolution. So it's not surprising that both Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx put the emphasis on industrial labor. And they had this whole notion of the labor theory of value. And I took out this quote here because I think it's quite funny. He obviously hated the opera because when he had to list the unproductive workers in the economy, every possible musician and opera singer was in there. So not only everyone in this room, so doctors, professors, lawyers, priests, players, buffoons, musicians, but both opera singers and opera dancers. And it's not that you could tell he went to the opera the night before. And it's not that he thought that this was bad stuff, but he just kind of was pointing to the fact that this was more the redistributive, and this was good. You wanted culture, but that we really had to better understand where the value in industrial labor was coming from, and that's why he obsessed about the division of labor, that pin factory example, how increases in productivity was the outcome of a smarter division of labor, and that would increase growth and what he called the wealth of nations. And what's really interesting with modern economic thought, and forgive forgive me for kind of doing this, but this is really important because this is a massive revolution in thinking, is the logic became reversed. Instead of thinking that you needed an understanding of where did value come from, regardless of whether you were right or wrong, but really kind of looking at these objective conditions, mechanization, division of labor, production, these different actors, how much money is being siphoned out, how much money is going back in. Again, this reproduction problem that I also mentioned with the robots example in the beginning. This idea that it's really supply and demand and marginal utility calculations, and it's all about preferences, kind of first of all changed the outlook to one that was all about subjective conditions. So workers' preferences for work versus leisure is what kind of helps us understand wages, they say, not the class struggle. We kind of, in fact, wipe off the class struggle from sort of economic theory, but also it's no longer kind of an understanding of value that determines how we think of price, and theories of price and supply and demand curves and equilibrium prices then determines our theory of value. It's a massive revolution, and most economic students today don't even realize that happened. And rent, which is really interesting. People don't realize that the wealth of nations in Adam Smith, he calls the free market free from rent. It was not free from the state, which is what here the Adam Smith Institute propagates. It was free from rent. And in order to rid rent from the system, you actually needed serious kind of policy to limit that rent seeking. And rent as unearned income. Very interesting. This isn't the modern day rent, which is seen even by people like Stiglitz, who are kind of on the center-left spectrum of the economy. In modern day thinking, rents are simply a result of some sort of imperfection in the system that is preventing us to get towards a competitive price. It can be then competed away somehow. But this idea in the classical economists of rent as unearned income would actually require you to better understand, well, what's actually happening there? What are the workers doing? What are the managers doing? What's the financial sector doing? How are they working together? And you could, in dynamic, interesting, not static ways, look at production, distribution, and how they work together. And that's quite interesting. So what I would like to argue is that when we get confused, when it becomes too subjective, and we kind of take our eye away also from production again, in terms of also the technological change, the social innovation, issues around the division of labor, issues really about governance, which in economics is barely talked about. That's mainly for business schools, which we know aren't as serious as economics departments. Just kidding. Then it becomes, that's part of the reason that it becomes also easy for someone like Lloyd Blankfein to say Goldman Sachs are the most productive in the world. And for me, this isn't, by the way, about saying there's one correct theory of value. It's that value should be contested, debated, understood. And these kind of interesting issues that were brought up even in the times of the physiocrats, we should come back to those today, but of course in the context of platform capitalism, the digital economy. And so what I do in the book, which I'm not going to do here, but I'm just going to tell you what's there, is why does this matter? Who the hell cares? This is just great, interesting, history of economic thought. And, well, first of all, it completely affects what we count in GDP. Right? So if you marry your cleaner, GDP goes down. If you pollute, GDP goes up. I'll let you figure that one out. Governance of organization. So we only include things that have prices. And this is, again, back to that teacher issue, that the salaries of the teachers goes in, but a well-structured public education system, the value that that actually produces to the economy, it's not included. So it's not surprising that we also don't really know how to do that sometimes. We undervalue anything, actually, it doesn't have a price. But what's even more interesting with that one, by the way, is that the financial sector, up until 1970s, wasn't even included in GDP, because it was actually seen as just a transfer of existing wealth, in the same way that you wouldn't include social security payments. When you started getting this massive increase of the financial sector in that Andy Haldane graph, what happened to the people who were thinking about how do we include different sectors in the economy, in the UN, they had a group called SNA, the Systems of National Accounts, who said, we better start including this thing. And so they actually gave a name in the national income and product accounts to financial services. They called it risk-taking for the investment banks, financial intermediation for the commercial banks, and didn't ask themselves these questions that, again, the physiocrats asked themselves. Well, what's this finance actually doing? Some of it actually might be really useful for the economy. Let's get a better sense of exactly what it's doing, literally in kind of objective terms, as opposed to just saying we need to give up a name to this thing called net interest payments, which until then had not gone in. Governance of organizations is interesting, and again, very relevant for your thinking here, because this point about maximizing shareholder value which many critique, not just me. There's all sorts of international debates about this, again, on both sides of the political spectrum. Theresa May has often, before she got obsessed with Brexit, talked quite a bit about the need for inclusive growth and the limits of maximizing shareholder value. That doesn't lead to much change unless you debunk the theory of value underpinning it. And if you want to read about it, I don't have time to tell you, but read Michael Jensen's work. He's the guy who kind of came up with it from Harvard Business School, which was mentioned before. And the idea is that shareholders are the only ones who don't have a guaranteed rate of return. They are the residual claimants. Once everyone else, all the lazy bastards in the economy, have been paid off, why are they lazy? Because they have a guaranteed rate of return. Then if there's something left over, that goes to the shareholder. So this massive risk that they took of maybe getting nothing is deserved. Now you go back and ask yourself, who has a guaranteed rate of return? So for example, all those examples I gave you before that I talk about in the entrepreneurial state, the internet, for every internet that was successful, there was plenty of failures. The Concorde plane that's not flying, it's kind of a failure. The Solyndra investment that Obama tried is a failure, but Tesla wasn't, right? Tesla was a huge success, same amount of money. In order to really kind of foster economic growth that's innovation-led has required huge amounts of risk-taking with no guaranteed rate of return by public actors. Workers, when they take jobs in different places, are taking huge risks, sometimes willing, for example, to accept a lower wage, a lower salary in the beginning, thinking they might have a career in that company. Why not? There's no guarantee that's going to work itself out. So one of the issues here is if you actually kind of debunk and contest the underlying idea of value in something like the maximizing shareholder value principle, that's where you might also start seeing some change. You can't just say, it's not fair, it's not right, it's too short-termist, it's bad, it doesn't lead to long-term growth. The underlying kind of value proposition. Pricing of medicines is the most scandalous. I sometimes give 3-hour talks on this. So medicines are the place that it's most easy, also because the data exists, to see this collective effort. Just in the US, $32 billion a year is spent by the US government on health innovation, and somehow internationally we've all bought into this idea of value-based pricing, which is basically, to put it really quickly, let the price go to whatever the market will bear. As we heard just some months ago when the price of an antibiotic and Nostrum Pharmaceuticals went up by 400% overnight, and the CEO literally said that we have a moral imperative to let the price go to what the market will bear, and that's called value-based pricing. Again, if you want, look it up. We also wrote a report on that called The People's Prescription. But that's what you need to debunk. You can't just say, oh, the prices are too high. Oh, this is unfair. People won't if a medicine is out there, it should be distributed. Actually debunking that idea of value-based pricing and showing how these pharmaceutical companies actually, if you look at what they're objectively doing in the system, of course they're adding value, but they're not the only ones, and how to make sure that also the taxpayers who have funded this research and innovation are benefiting from the outputs that are created, as well as having a redistributive model regardless of who's creating it. The digital platform area, I think, is one of the most interesting, because at best we've worried about things like privacy or taxation. Big news in recent weeks with the European Commission taxing Google 1 billion. But that's, again, too reactive in the same way that the just transition for trade unions is too reactive. Better understanding how this data is generated, how it's also, the technology itself that's being used to retrieve the data, that's an outcome I've already mentioned, GPS and internet. What would Uber and Google be without those? But literally the data is generated by citizens, so every time you click on Uber or Citymapper or Google, you are generating data. Instead of just worrying about things post facto, why not just literally change that relationship? And there's a really interesting experiment in Barcelona where the mayor, Ada Colau, and her chief digital officer, Francesca Bria, and the whole team there are trying to rethink that. They're saying when citizens in Barcelona create data, clicking on Citymapper, let's rethink how that data is generated, where it might go into a more public, collective type of repository, where then the companies themselves would have to kind of dip into either paying or signing up to certain conditions, but especially their idea is that that data is then used to create public value, so go into informing a more interesting, dynamic, creative type of public transport system. So, changing those relationships, based on also the value proposition of where the data is generated, how it's generated, and the value that citizens are contributing to digital platform by clicking every 2 seconds. And the role of the state is the most interesting for me. Sorry, this has come out weird. In terms of the fact that, and this kind of goes back again to the entrepreneurial state, where if we only understand the government as just fixing markets, it's really actually hard to understand this massive value that it can produce when it is actually much more ambitious. Again, the BBC, which hasn't just done the public good, it's actually been ambitious in terms of trying to get every kid to code in the 1980s, which actually the procurement for that then created the microcomputer, which actually then allowed the few tech companies in this country that had international relevance, like Acorn and ARM, to scale up. That kind of ambitious activity, also in not just creating the welfare state, but really designing interesting health systems, we don't actually have a way to think about that if we don't know how to value it. And what's really interesting, and sorry you can't see this, is that if we don't know how to value it, then it also becomes hard to know what you need in bureaucrats, right? And the word, oh, it's so bureaucratic, is like a negative thing, right? But actually, we could have sexy bureaucrats. We could have really dynamic and creative bureaucrats if we thought that government had an important role in creating value in the same ways that MBA students will study these fantastic courses like strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior, which is all about governance. That's only because we know private sector companies create value, but that same level of ambition isn't really given to us in terms of how we train the civil service. And this is why the department I've just set up at UCL kind of has this as its ambition to create a new master's in public administration, which we're beginning in September, which is all about kind of putting public value, public purpose, creativity, exploration, experimentation also back into the way that we think about government. My God, I don't know what's happened here. It must have been from the Apple computer to something else. So what to do? Let me just say quickly, the first thing, and I think the most relevant thing for this audience, is really honing down on this idea that value is created collectively. We need to understand what that means. It's not enough to critique shareholder maximization. What do we really mean by stakeholder governance within companies? It's definitely also about ownership, but not only. It's about how an employee-owned company, also what kind of discussions it's having in the economy. For example, if we have something like the industrial strategy as we have in this country, what do we mean by a challenge-led industrial strategy? Who's setting what these challenges are? Who's at the table in the first place deciding what a green transition, as I was saying, means? Organizations need, of course, capabilities and governance structures to create long-run value, but that's equally true of a private, public, third sector organizations. And again, I keep mentioning trade unions, which I think there's a huge opportunity today for them to rethink how they govern themselves as well. And markets themselves aren't just kind of these forces out there causing short-termism. Markets are outcomes of how public, private, and third sector institutions are interacting. So what kind of market outcomes do we want, instead of going back to the old nationalize this or privatize that? And this whole issue of the production boundary of the makers and takers, it's not about blaming finance for being rubbish. We've actually rewarded those kinds of activities. So how do we not level the playing field? We will never get a green transition by leveling the playing field, but if we do want long-term growth, if we want sustainable growth, if we want to use innovation to guide the 21st century welfare state, we need to really start steering more activities inside the production boundary, limiting this kind of value extraction, which we've seen in the financial sector, but they've been rewarded to do so. We still have a taxation system where capital gains, for example, is, I think, too low. Other taxes should be low for those kinds of things we want to incentivize. For example, we should surely be taxing materials at least more than labor. And this whole notion of we actually maybe also need new institutions like the city of Barcelona is thinking about to reverse these relationships. So where the data even goes in the first place is thought about. We don't necessarily have those institutions. And in this report that I recently wrote for the European Commission, which I'll spend just 2 minutes on, first of all, this was great because unlike books, which might sell and you kind of do the Oprah Winfrey thing, this made law. So the European Parliament and European Council voted on this concept of missions to replace this more kind of blah, blah, bland challenge-oriented policies that they had. It's very easy for people to talk about climate change. It's another thing to say, let's actually formulate some missions which we have to succeed, like getting to the moon and back again, where you can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? So the idea is that you begin with the challenges. The SDGs are there. Let's use them. They were already co-created in the sense of lots of international discussion of what they should be, but turning them into concrete missions, which then require lots of sectors across the economy, so you don't have sectoral policy, but mission-oriented policy to achieve them, and then using everything that government has at its disposal, like procurement policy, prize schemes, grants, to really crowd in all sorts of different solutions between different types of actors in the economy. So with climate change, instead of just doing that talk, really having a carbon neutral city would require investment, innovation, reinvestment of profits, and being rewarded to do so by industries as different as real estate, construction, AI, big data, social, behavioral economics, but again, all the different projects that would need to be fueled to get there. So going to the moon, there were something like 15 different sectors and 300 projects, of which most failed. And so also that willingness to experiment, explore, and these bottom-up solutions that are required because top-down doesn't work. Clean oceans, there's lots of talk about that, especially after David Attenborough's wonderful Blue Planet series. Lots of kids know about this because they saw those baby dolphins with all that plastic inside their tummies. What do we actually do about that? Again, think through the different sectors and reorient your instruments away from just kind of SME policy. Who cares about firm size? Sectoral policy. Why worry about a sector? What do you want that sector to do? This is really important because industrial strategy used to be very sector-based, right? So even Vince Cable had his list of finance, automotive, aerospace, financial services, and creative industries. What do you want these sectors to do? So to really get debate across the spectrum, of course, government sort of hosting those debates, but different businesses, different stakeholder groups at the table to even define maybe what these missions are. And that's quite important because, first of all, the challenges and the missions really have to be bold and inspirational just to kind of get people excited. But in order to be cross-disciplinary, cross-actor, and cross-sectoral, you also have to, again, as I said, design those instruments to really crowd in those organizations in different ways. And the power of procurement policy, I don't think we've realized just how important it is. The budgets that different departments have for procurement is huge compared to anything like an innovation budget, a development budget, an industrial strategy budget. And this whole issue of ownership, I think, is really interesting because it also is, if you're going to be socializing the risks in the economy by actually really bringing different actors together and all of them experimenting, exploring, and perhaps screwing up along the way and saying that's okay, trial and error, really thinking about how you then distribute those rewards in ways that are governed in this stakeholder way and not shareholder maximization way is very important. Bell Labs, which was one of the most important innovation companies, or if you want, units inside a private company, came out of an era where the US government was much more confident in demanding that profits be reinvested back in. So AT&T, in order to retain its monopoly on telecoms, had to reinvest its profits in the economy, in innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. That was literally the deal that government gave in order to have that monopoly status. There's other ways. Again, the prices of drugs, of course they should reflect that more collective effort. But also, there's all sorts of conditions that could be attached. So in Scotland, where I'm working with Nicola Sturgeon, they have a business pledge with 10 different conditions, including paying the minimum wage, reinvesting profits also into worker training. Those conditions could also become conditions before you get some sort of government subsidy, investment loan, to make sure you're also the kind of company that's willing, if you want to play the game on, for example, these inclusive growth agendas. Let me just say, just the last thing, which is that, coming back to purpose, this is where I think purpose becomes disruptive because it doesn't just become something that you do in a silo. It's not just how you govern a company. It's literally how you rethink the economy. So if value is actually created collectively, how can you make sure that both the governance structure within a company, but also how they're relating and how they have access or not to different government programs is, again, comes back to this idea that the economy doesn't just have a rate, but it has a direction. And we've set up this network that we hope to also involve your organization in terms of really thinking through some of the issues, which we call the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network. And it's co-funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. We just had our meeting last week in Bellagio, where this idea of also sharing the experiences between different types of organizations, of how difficult it is actually to be sort of outside of the silo. So for the government organizations, they're sharing their experience of jumping out of the market, fixing one, and for companies that are actually more purpose-driven, how, what are the challenges also in terms of new types of public-private partnerships that are more interesting and ambitious than the current ones. And so in Scotland, as I mentioned, we also helped them formulate actually a new institution. If it's true that we have too much financialization and need more patient long-term finance, the first thing we did after convincing Nicola Sturgeon, this is all work, through the Institute, was to say, be careful though, the last thing you want is a public bank just handing out money. Again, make it a mission-oriented public bank, which is providing long-term patient strategic finance to those organizations that are willing to kind of go after some difficult challenges that you have, whether they're technological or more societal around issues like aging. And in the UK, we're working very closely with Greg Clark, having actually helped them turn the industrial strategy into a challenge-led approach. It was great. Our first working paper at the Institute was actually cited in the strategy for why they chose a more challenge-led, not sectoral basis. But then David Willits and I we chair a commission called Mission-Oriented Industrial Strategy, where we're trying to turn these different challenges into concrete goals, like what would it look like to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, and active zero-emission mobility products and services by 2040, where that word fully accessible is also up there. Think of all the innovations you would require to have also a public infrastructure, for example, where it's 100% accessible by people with disabilities. That, again, requires lots of thinking about organizational and technological innovation in terms of reaching that goal. Working a lot with cities. I was happy that Deb mentioned the very important role of cities. Cities have very concrete problems that can only be solved by collective efforts, but also that you can say yes or no. Did you achieve it? It's interesting, actually, that in the US, it's more the cities and the states that are resisting Trump's agenda, but using the tentacles of the different services that cities provide to citizens as ways to foster innovation and bring together different types of collaborations is quite interesting. We're working with Manchester on that. Let me just finish here to say that in order to, again, do more than just talking about the SDGs, finding really interesting ways for public, private, third sector partnerships to work together across their value chain, as opposed to just worrying about kind of philanthropic giving, and instead of being so comfortably talking about value and value creation and purpose and B Corps, but to think through what does it mean in 21st century capitalism to give just as much attention to the direction of growth and to put value at the heart of how we think about organizational governance, but also these interrelationships between different types of organizations in order to really meet the SDGs in concrete ways that city mayors, state governors, national prime ministers, and those transnational organizations can work with together. I really think if we don't get that right, then let's just not even talk about the SDGs. Let's just kind of talk. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
So first of all, thank you, Mariana, not just for stimulating our minds about thinking where value might come from, but certainly leaving me with lots of thoughts about the connections between what you're talking about and the connections into the employee ownership world, not least sharing reward and influence amongst employees, actually socialising capital, which I think is what I've written about in the past, and where value is measured in the employee ownership arena by delivering long-term sustainable business that makes a meaningful contribution to local economies. I'd like to also thank you, David and Isabel, for reconnecting us with Robert, and the magic, I think was the word you used to describe him. I think for the team and the board and myself, many of us who never had the pleasure of meeting Robert, hearing those very personal stories, and for many of you in the room, it must bring to life the purpose of the EOA and clarify, I think, our mission, which I'm going to give some thought to after Mariana's speech. I'd like to also thank Robert Postlethwaite for his kind support of today's event, and to Robert's family, who have constantly supported this event since we launched it. So finally, I'd just like to remind you all, it's Employee Ownership Day around the corner on the 28th of June. It's the first time ever in our 40 years that we're actually doing this in collaboration with one of our members. So Community Dental Services, you've probably read about in our marketing activity. We're helping them hopefully to raise £40,000 to help children learn how to brush their teeth, which sounds like a really straightforward thing. Most of us as parents will have taught our children how to brush their teeth. Sadly, lots of children don't know how to do that, and it leads to many thousands of them being hospitalised each year. So we hope that you can join with us in that campaign this year, which we think is a very worthy campaign in our 40th year, and connected to how you make yourself smile every day in your employee-owned businesses. So if you haven't seen that information, go online, you can find it. In fact, there's the little logo just to show you. I love our design team. They always come up with a take on the EO. We've got an EO, smiley EO there. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. It's been filmed, so both Mariana's fantastic lecture and the presentation slides will be available online at some point. I'm not sure exactly when, so do feel free to go and revisit it. I know I will be, because I did feel like we were running at 100 miles an hour then, not in terms of how fast Mariana spoke, because she didn't. It was actually just about the pure quality of the content and the thinking, and I do need to go back and revisit that myself. We have lunch outside. There's an opportunity to purchase Mariana's book, and for the next 15 minutes, she'll be here maybe to get it signed as well. So please do move outside now. I'm just going to ask the speakers and the family just to stay behind. We want some photographs before we let Mariana out there, and then you can grab her outside, providing she gets some food, because clearly that's what she needs. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at another EOA event.